I'm going to invite our second presenter to come forward now, Dr. Gilbert Valentine from La Sierra University and Avondale University. The title of his paper is Trauma and Testimony, a Case Study. Thank you.
Thanks so much, and thank you, Denny. That was a dark story. This one may be darker. Let me share just a brief preamble, if I might. This paper has been extraordinarily difficult to write. Many multiple layers of complexity, many different possible entry points and pathways. But its greatest difficulty is that it wrestles with what for me is one of the most challenging documents in Ellen White's ministry. While the paper reflects on a trauma caused by a testimony 140 years ago, undertaking the research and sharing the paper today generates its own fresh spiritual trauma. A close reading of the document and a close study of the episode creates trauma because it fractures the more simple, secure, and ultimately inadequate explanations of the way we thought Ellen White's giftedness functioned. For most of us in this room, if not all of us, respect for the genuine charisma that Ellen White possessed has been nurtured over long years of acquaintance with her books, her letters, and her manuscripts that provide evidence of the authenticity of the distinctive claim to knowledge and a relationship with the divine quite beyond the ordinary. Trauma is experienced when trust in those inadequate explanations is placed in wrenching tension with conflicting facts. When perspectives of the testimony writer need to be meshed with realities and with the perspectives of the testimony recipient. And that's not an easy thing to do. This paper is a work still in progress with no final conclusions. When we are done, problems remain. And there may be more yet to learn of the background. It's a long paper. You've noticed that on the web page, 30 pages, and I'm going to condense the paper into my 20 minutes. The case. In early August 1883, the founder of the church's mission to Europe, John Andrews, was read a demoralizing, though pastorally well-intentioned, 13-page testimony of harsh rebuke from Ellen White. It was read to him by Elder Buell Whitney, the former New York and Pennsylvania Conference president. Whitney had been called initially to help Andrews in Switzerland, but when it was realized that Andrews was so near death, Whitney replaced him as the leader. At the time he received the testimony, 55-year-old Andrews was confined to bed in the mission house in Basel, suffering acutely from end-stage tuberculosis. It was the last letter he would receive from Ellen White. He would die of the disease just 10 weeks later. This episode may be seen to relate to trauma from at least three perspectives. First, Ellen White, the author, 18 months previously, had experienced her own trauma in the sudden loss of her husband from malaria, after he had endured a long, stressful period of decline and increasing functional impairment, occasioned by repeated strokes that had at times severely stressed their marriage. He had been obliged to exit church leadership in less than optimal or edifying circumstances. To what degree was Ellen White subconsciously concerned about protecting and preserving the reputation of her late husband, who had so often been in conflict with Andrews? Would Andrews be made the hero for the church? She feared. Secondly, John Andrews, the recipient, had experienced repeated trauma in the death of his wife and two daughters, and through multiple episodes of shaming and humiliation that Denny has just shared with us, what happened to butler happened to John Andrews. James White's leadership style was highly autocratic and controlling, which led to much conflict. More recently, the threat of the closure of Andrews' French church paper because of financial difficulties at the General Conference had traumatised him severely. These episodes, the humiliation, the threat of the closure of the paper, seem to have scarred Andrews permanently and shaped his decision-making and his attitudes in negative ways, paralleling perhaps symptoms of what in the mental health profession now is recently diagnosed as moral injury. Thirdly, the severe testimony letter itself induced significant trauma that impacted Andrew's mental health, deepening his depression. At the time Andrews at the time Ellen White sent the testimony to Whitney, that was in March 1883, so that he could read it to Andrews when he arrived in Basel. By that time, Ellen White had formed a very negative view of Andrews' work in Europe, feeling that it had not progressed as it should have. When some asked whether she thought Andrews might die, she had burst out with the brusque reply, "I think he will, and I could not pray for his life. For I consider he has held and is still holding back the work in Switzerland." Really? She could not pray for this pioneer Adventist missionary? In Basel, at the very same time that she was uttering that expression, Andrews, struggling doggedly against his illness, and his editorial assistant, Jean Vilmier, believed that the painful production of each new issue of the magazine was a direct answer to their many prayers. Each issue they saw as a miracle. Is there a tension here? Do you see it? Ellen White had told Whitney in her covering letter that she did not want to injure Elder Andrews. She had written with a deep pastoral intent, but her testimony letter did injure her colleague. It was hurtful and damaging both to Andrews' psyche and to his reputation. Within the testimony letter, Ellen White mentions, that's within the one that was read to him, Ellen White mentions that Andrews had often been accused unjustly and injured at the hands of her husband. Ellen White had often lamented her husband's inclination to carry grudges. He had exhibited a cruel tendency to go back and call up the past with a view to injuring Andrew's influence among his brethren, and then expected him to repeatedly rehearse his earlier confessions. In this, Ellen White saw James as unforgiving to his brethren and to his children, she said. And yet, this 1883 testimony letter seems to do the very same thing. It calls up numerous incidents from the past to point out Andrew's faults for the purpose, it seems, of diminishing any undue influence Andrews might have on Whitney as Whitney took over as leader. The decisions made in the past, Andrews could not undo. He was beyond repairing or addressing most of the faults the testimony letter described. Did the letter therefore achieve its pastoral intent? Did the injury lead to healing? This paper explores the contextual background of this difficult testimony letter in the context of trauma, focusing on both the author and the recipient with a view to better understanding possible trauma-influenced authorial perspectives and expected outcomes. Reactions to the testimony. Andrews, in his response to Ellen White just a month before he died, described this last testimony as a severe rebuke. Scholars, in the light of longer and wider reflection, have been seriously perplexed at what they find in the letter. Historian Grady Smoot read it as the most severe rebuke Ellen White had ever written to Andrews. Swiss theologian Daniel Augsburger said that Ellen White had scolded Andrews severely. And language professor Pietro Capizzi notes that because Andrews was on his deathbed, the language of the letter may appear unnecessarily harsh and almost pitiless. To modern readers, the letter can come across as a harsh, devastating critique of Andrews' temperament and personality, with a very negative critique of the way he had done his work in Europe. As we have noticed in her covering letter to Whitney, Ellen White had said, "I don't want to injure Andrews." But injured indeed he was, both at the time and in the wider public assessment of his reputation in the church, when only this letter is used as the lens to make an assessment of his life. For many years, this letter was considered so potentially injurious to other members of the Andrews family that it was not available for public reading. Whether it was kept in the Z file or not, I don't know. When, for example, the Swiss-French Daniel Walther, church history professor at the seminary in 1955, requested permission to read the letter as part of his research for a class he was teaching in Adventist history, he was denied the opportunity by Arthur White, denied access to the letter by Arthur White. And then the following day, when he protested, he was allowed to read only 11 pages of the 13-page document, because there were still some descendants of the living, some descendants apparently living nearby. That was the reason. Deeply offended, Walther suggested the suspension of his research class at the seminary until the questions on his integrity and his academic professional ability were resolved. Clearly, there were problems with this testimony letter. And yet, on the other hand, thanks to Denny here, who shared these letters with me, when George Butler, President of the General Conference in 1883, confidentially read the letter several weeks before it was read to Andrews, he saw it as an excellent testimony, which had been written in such a kind and blessed spirit, so mild and clear, was almost as true as Scripture, was Butler's assessment. Butler was a very close friend of Andrews. They were related by marriage. Andrews had been instrumental in Butler's conversion, had baptized him. And he felt a great deal of gratitude to Andrews. What Ellen White had observed about Andrews' peculiar academic temperament, his strong viewpoints, his deep sense of duty, and his personal qualities, resonated with Butler's own perception of that missionary, of his friend. Ellen White, while valuing Andrews' distinctive gifts and his scholarly nature and his skill set, nevertheless had great difficulty relating to these within the framework of her urgent, imminent eschatology. She didn't like wasting time on footnotes, and Andrews did a lot of that. In the next section of the paper, from pages 6 to 9, I discuss why Butler reacted positively to the letter. He had two complicated administrative problems to resolve, and the timeliness of the letter helped Butler resolve his two dilemmas. And I discuss how the letter helped Butler resolve those two dilemmas. But even as Butler responded positively to the letter, he was fearful of the shock it would cause his friend. And he tried to warn Andrews in advance of what was coming, to avoid a situation where the whole thing would land on him all at once in a lump. There was clearly much ambivalence and some anxiety about the letter before it was read to Andrews. In truth, behind this anxiety, there was considerable misunderstanding on the part of all participants in the drama of this last sad communication to Andrews. There is the deeply troubling testimony letter from Ellen White itself, with its embedded misunderstandings and some naive assumptions about planting an American church in Europe and European culture. There was Andrews' dogged defence of his journal and his perception of the importance of his role in that whole process. That needed to be corrected. There is Andrews' own misunderstanding and mistrust of Haskell and Butler. Haskell had done an audit on the mission in Switzerland. And as a result of that, Andrews was distrustful of the General Conference leadership because he thought they didn't trust his use of money in Europe. And behind all this were misunderstandings on the part of all the participants about the nature and the course of Andrew's disease, the possibility of a cure or not, and how to understand providence. I'll go quickly. So there are many layers of complexity here. In the next section, beyond that, I also deal in detail with the disease that Andrew suffered from, why it was so problematic, and how Kellogg's assessment of it as just a lung problem confused people and confused Ellen White, in fact. Testimony and trauma. As Butler had feared, the testimony did come as a shock and traumatised Andrews. A month after hearing and mulling over the testimony, Andrews confided to his mother and his sister-in-law, Martha, in a private conversation, the profound sense of hurt and bleak discouragement. He had the sense that his life had been a total failure. It had all been in vain. Nothing he had done had been valued. And no matter what he would do, he'd be criticised for it. That was his feeling. Jean Vumier, who was present in the room, overheard the sad conversation and recorded it in his diary. As I note in my biography of Andrews, very few of the things Ellen White severely reproved in Andrews in this letter could actually have been changed, so close to the end of his life. He could change his attitude to the General Conference and its leaders, yes, and he did so after the misunderstandings were cleared up. But he could not change his temperament, undo his decision not to remarry. He couldn't re-educate his children. One was 20, the other had died at 16. And he knew that pushing back against the criticism with explanations about circumstances and reasons for decision after much prayer and adjusting to the European culture, that wouldn't achieve anything except to sound like self-justification. But Andrews had long ago prayed for the grace of submission, and he found it again on this occasion. A month before his death, he replied to Ellen White, after discovering to his embarrassment that Whitney had not indicated what he had asked Whitney to tell Ellen White after he read the letter to Andrews. He wrote, "I've tried to humble myself before God to receive the severe rebuke. Despite the harsh denunciations, he affirmed his faith and alluded to a reference in the last line of the testimony, 'I can say my feet are on the solid rock of ages. The Lord holds me by my right hand.'" But really, in the context of the theme of this conference, it could be asked, was the repeated submission, which had at times become subservience, really spiritually healthy? Look at Appendix 1 later. Take some time to do that. I imagine a scene where Ellen White and Andrews are sitting down together and talking through the circumstances in which Andrews was working and why he made the decisions he made. I try and analyse Ellen White's use of the term "I was shown" or "I saw," 3 or 4 uses in the letter, and how an immediate context sort of doesn't make them quite so absolute and universal as we might think. Almost the last section here, the writing of the testimony. The last section of my paper, from page 49, addresses the circumstances surrounding the writing of the letter and the information at the beginning of the letter that is critical for an adequate interpretation of this episode. If the testimony letter Whitney took with him to Europe had been difficult for him to read to Andrews on his deathbed, it had been difficult for Ellen White to write. She had made numerous attempts over several weeks and was unhappy with all of her attempts and didn't feel free to send them. We have one 3-page fragment of each an unsent letter, dated March 17. It was 2 weeks before she finally finished writing the letter satisfactorily enough for her to send it to Whitney to read. In Appendix 1, I compare the 2 letters and I notice the language between them. Why did Ellen White find it difficult to write the letter. She explains that she was unsure of herself. She felt unsure about the project. She had not been well, for one thing, and for another, she felt she did not have enough information or perspective and felt she needed to talk more to people who'd been, 1 minute ago, she felt she needed to talk to more people who had visited Andrews more recently. Haskell and Gardner had just spent 6 months touring Europe, trying to find out how mission worked in Europe. They'd come back. She hadn't had a chance to talk to either of them. And she felt that she didn't have enough information to be able to write comfortably. So she was perplexed. That was not the first time in this particular troubled period in the denomination's development that Ellen White felt uncertain about what counsel she could give. In 1879, just 4 years earlier, she had told her son, Willie White, to do 4 different things over a period of 4 months. Go to college to study? No. Go to Europe? You need to go? No, stay in California. And he was confused, and she was confused. And she wrote this to him after all that. We may err and do and say things that may not be all right. Have you ever heard Ellen White say that before? We hope that no one will be injured in any way by our sayings or doings. She was not sure what she had said to her son in 1879, that was the right thing to do, though she had written a kind of a testimony letter to him. 7 years later, in 1886, I'm getting near to the end, Ellen White had again encountered a situation where she had to acknowledge that she had been perplexed to know what to write. She had written a letter of rebuke to Butler about work in New York. It was such a strong rebuke to Butler and stunned him, according to Denny Fortin, that it took him 3 months to process the letter. And then he wrote a 32-page reply to her and pushed back and said, you've got it wrong. Those things did not happen in New York, and I wasn't there at the time. Andrews could never do that very well. What Ellen White's response to that was that she was sorry she had written that to Butler and asked him to send the letters back so she could read what she'd said. She wasn't sure. And she apologized to Butler for injuring him. That was 1886. 1883, Andrews didn't have the chance to write a reply similar to what Butler had written in response to the 86th letter. The other factor about the uncertainty of this letter, it was written March 29, read in early August, sent March 30 to Whitney, who was on his way to Europe. In the review, a special supplement was published in mid-May. And in that supplement of the review, devoted to mission in Europe and elsewhere, Haskell and Butler and Gardner had written a defense of Andrews. They had audited his books, and they affirmed that he had not used money unwisely at all. He had been honest with his use of money. The problem was that there was no real solid policy framework. This was the first venture into mission overseas, and there was no policy framework for expenses. He wasn't paid a salary. He was expected just to sort of sort out what was personal expenses and what was mission expenses on his own out of the pool, the budget pool. So, I finished. Let me read the conclusion. So, the last minute for conclusion. Ellen White concluded her testimony letter to Andrews with the inclusive comment that we are none of us infallible. The observation needs to be taken seriously as one seeks to understand the complexities surrounding Ellen White's last letter to Andrews. The counselled and the counsellor, it suggests, are unavoidably prone to differing and conflicting assessments and perspectives. Is there any takeaway from our reflections on this difficult episode of testimony and trauma? Life is complex and perplexing. Church life often more so. And perhaps that is enough to remind us all of our deep need of grace and a transformed heart that extends forgiveness to others. And that points the way to a better world than the one we live in. Thank you.